Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the brutal, authoritarian, totalitarian, capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day being a happy little worker, getting your surplus value being exploited in a most happy manner, I too am having an amazing day. And if I'm having an amazing day, you should also be having an amazing day. Now, first of all, before we start this video, I have to make it absolutely clear that this video is most certainly propaganda, right? I know propaganda sounds like a dirty word, but make no mistake, this video is socialist propaganda, yeah? There's plenty of capitalist propaganda going around, but you see, capitalists are a lot sneakier than we are in the sense that, you know, they make their propaganda seem appealing in the sense that you will end up going to hell while looking forward to the trip. But you see, we socialists don't have anything to hide, right? We don't want to try and trick you into supporting something that you don't truly believe in, right? We lay out our philosophy bare and square, and if you don't want to support us, that's fine. But just so you know, my goal is to convert you over to socialism. Not through the barrel of a gun, mind you, but through the magical power of persuasion. Okay, this video is part of a two-part series entitled 5 Myths About Socialism. Now, as a result of being propagandized for years and years and years, people seem to have the wrong idea about socialism, and they have been brainwashed into a sense of false consciousness, believing that socialism is something entirely different from what it really is. So it is my hope in this two-part series that I'm creating that I can rectify some of the misconceptions people have about socialism. So this is part 1 of a two-part series entitled 5 Myths About Socialism. Actually, no, it's called 5 Lies You've Been Told About Socialism. And the next video, which will be released next week, will be entitled 5 More Lies You've Been Told About Socialism. Right? So I'm going to be going through some lies or misconceptions, some common myths, if you will, that many people all around the world, especially in the capitalist reactionary world, seem to believe about socialism. So let's begin. Myth number 1. Socialists just want free stuff. And socialism is when rich people finance the lifestyles of poor people who are too lazy and irresponsible with money. Yes, we often hear neoliberal right-wing reactionaries like Margaret Thatcher, Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, and Ronald Reagan going on and on and on about how socialism is really a means of robbing the deserving to feed the undeserving. Sort of a perverse metaphorical Robin Hood, if you will. Well, the fact of the matter is that nobody, not Karl Marx, not Vladimir Lenin, not any socialist academic in history, has ever talked about free stuff, right? No. Socialism is not anarchism, first of all. It is not a society in which there's a free-for-all and everybody doesn't have to follow rules. And basically, you know, you get to take from the rich as and when you please, right? It's not some kind of vulgar adventurism, right? But this idea that socialism is basically about the forced redistribution of wealth, right? From the deserving to the undeserving is an idea that's pushed very often in reactionary circles. I believe it was Margaret Thatcher who said that socialism sounds like a good idea until you run out of everyone else's money. Except that that's not what socialism really is. No, you see, socialism is not, has never been, and never will be about getting the privileged and wealthy in society to be nicer to the less fortunate, right? That is social democracy, something which the right wing's hero, Adam Smith, would have also vehemently supported, right? You know, it's funny because you hear all these right-wing Republicans oohing and eyeing over Adam Smith, but they don't realize that Adam Smith actually supported universal basic income. And he also supported the higher taxation on the rich in order to give welfare to the poor, right? No, those are inconvenient aspects of their hero, you see, the father, the so-called father of modern-day capitalism. No. But the fact of the matter is that social democracy has more in line with the philosophy of Adam Smith, who is not a bad guy, yeah? He's not a bad guy. Misguided perhaps, but not a bad guy, because he had good intentions, although the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Social democracy has more in common with the philosophy of Adam Smith and liberal thinkers of the 19th century than it does with Karl Marx. Because Karl Marx's idea of socialism was not about getting rich, privileged people to try and placate the masses by being nicer to them. No. Karl Marx's idea of socialism was about seizing the means of production, right? Marx makes it very clear that socialism, in a Marxian sense, is about the workers, whom we call the proletariat, seizing the means of production, which means the capital, the stuff that you use to make stuff, right? Like the factories, the raw goods, the raw materials, the places of work. The working class taking over these places of work and ousting the ruling class, right? Because from a Marxian point of view, the bourgeoisie is superfluous because the capitalist, the boss of a company or an organization or a factory, right, sits around and collects money. But it is the workers who produce surplus value. It is the workers who give life to the objects they create, right? They turn raw materials into actual objects that can be sold for a profit, right? And it is therefore the workers who should be duly remunerated for their efforts, right? With what they're worth. That is the basic idea about socialism. It's not about getting the capitalists to be nicer to the workers by giving them longer lunch breaks or taking them out for drinks after work or, giving to charity every now and then. No, it's about abolishing the ruling class, abolishing the capitalist class and creating a dictatorship of the working class. Is that clear? Now, whether or not you think that's feasible, that's another issue altogether. But I just want to make it very clear that socialism is not about robbing the undeserving and not about robbing the deserving and rewarding the undeserving. But do you know what system rewards the undeserving and robs the deserving? Capitalism. That's right. Giorgio Armani, for example, sells one of his shirts for 1,000 ringgit, 2,000 ringgit each, right? Do you think that his sweatshop workers in a place like Bangladesh will ever earn that much in a month, while that sweatshop worker produces dozens of those shirts in a month for him, right? So he sits back, collects the money, enjoys his private yachts and private mansions and private parties. Bourgeois parties are always a rather Bacchanalian affair. But the sweatshop worker in Bangladesh takes but a minute fraction of what he produces, right? While the surplus value, the profit, is basically appropriated by the capitalist, who does not produce the finished product, right? Do you see someone like Armani or Zara or any of these capitalist dictators producing the clothes that they sell to the consumer? No, they don't. They rely on sweatshop workers for that. So if anything, socialism is actually about basically rewarding the deserving, right? And basically giving the deserving what is rightfully theirs by dismantling the class system altogether. Myth number 2. Socialists are violent and unhinged radicals who will force their way of life on everybody. Arrgh. Look at me. Do I look like a violent man? Do I look like a man who would hurt a teddy bear? Do I? Do I? Do I look remotely violent? No, actually I'm a very gentle man, you know, an extremely gentle man, in whom the milk of human kindness flows in every vein. No, I could not even hurt a hamster. Well, I would think that forcibly removing people from Africa, putting them on cotton plantations and whipping them is more than a little violent. You know, I would think that, you know, invading a region, enslaving the population and cutting off people's hands if they don't meet a certain quota of gold or diamonds is also pretty violent, don't you think? But apparently we are supposed to be the violent and unhinged ones, right? Well, I suppose you could validly make the case that socialist leaders throughout history have indeed used violent means in order to get their way. For example, the killing of the Romanov family in Russia, right? That was carried out by the communists. Now, that's not something that I approve of, right? I mean, personally, I wouldn't have done it that way, you know, but you know how much of a pragmatist the Soviet communists, the Bolsheviks were, right? So, you know, everyone does things differently, just like, you know, there are different types of Christians, or there are different types of Muslims, right? Some are peaceful, some are violent, right? But the fact of the matter is that socialists are not inherently more violent than anyone else, right? And as a matter of fact, the violence that you see socialists carry out, capitalists or neoliberals have carried out far, far worse violence in the name of capital, right? You know, I would think that, you know, invading the Middle East for oil is a pretty violent thing to do, right? Just because you wanted some oil. But socialists are not more inherently violent than others. And in fact, oftentimes the violence that socialist revolutionaries carry out is oftentimes a reaction to fascism, right? You think that the communists of Malaya were violent, right? In the 1940s and 1950s. But the Japanese and the British were far, far, far more violent, right? Oftentimes, socialist revolutionaries, when they commit acts of violence, it is a response to even greater violence on the people, right? For instance, let's use the case of Tsar Nicholas I. Was killing him and his entire family cruel? Yes, it most certainly was, right? Was it necessary? Now that's debatable. Yes, you may think it's cruel that, you know, Tsar Nicholas and his entire family was killed in cold blood by the Bolshevik communists, right? But has it ever occurred to you that the Tsar killed far, far more people than just 7 or 8 people, and the Tsar sent thousands of young men to die needlessly in his foreign wars, in the Sino-Japanese War of 1905 and the First World War of 1914. You think it's cruel that the Tsar and his family were killed off in cold blood, right? But has it ever occurred to you that the Tsar himself was cruel, not just to a handful of people, but to thousands of people who were sent to die in muddy battlefields or who were left to starve at home while the Russian nobility were dining on caviar and wearing fine furs? Is that not cruel? Is it not cruel to put down a workers' protests, like Bloody Sunday, for example? Is it not cruel to use violent means, to use the army to put down a workers' protest? Why is that not cruel? So while I am not going to say that the Tsar's family had it coming because his children were innocent, the Tsar was no angel either, right? And just like, in the case of the French Revolution, when French nobility were getting their heads cut off, right? There is a reason why the Tsar was executed. And it's not simply because he was born richer or more privileged than other people, but rather by what he was doing to the people, his crimes against the people, right? So basically, I just want to wrap up this point by saying that, socialists are not inherently more violent than others. And in fact, many peace-loving, kind, and gentle people such as Albert Einstein, Oscar Wilde, and Helen Keller also considered themselves socialists. Were they gun-toting guerrillas, violent gun-toting guerrillas who were going out to abuse and oppress people? Of course not. Myth number 3. Socialism is a white man's philosophy. Now this is one that really has to die. Because the fact of the matter is that dialectical thinking, dialectical materialism has been around for a bloody long time. Even before the birth of Karl Marx, Karl Marx did not invent socialism, this idea of class struggle or progression towards a classless society, right? Karl Marx merely tabulated or jotted down his observations, much like Charles Darwin jotted down his observations about the natural world. But it certainly does not mean that Darwin invented evolution, because you cannot really invent a natural phenomenon, right? No. Even in the ancient times, before capitalism even came into being, right? There were people such as the Buddha, the Indian philosopher Buddha, who were already dialectical thinkers, who were already pushing for a fairer, classless society, right? In ancient times, there were already people who understood that history progresses through class struggles. The history of humankind is a history of class struggles, right? And the ultimate goal should be a classless society, right? This is not a white man's philosophy. That's why I don't call myself a Marxist, quite frankly. I do consider Marx to be an influence in my life, but I would never deign to call myself a Marxist, because I think it's restrictive to basically tie yourself down to one philosophy, right? I don't think of Marx as some kind of messiah, for example, and I will not bow before a portrait of Marx. If you look at my username, it's Comrade Confucius. Why? Because I'm a Confucian socialist, right? Fundamentally, my influence is Confucius, right? But Marx has a lot of valuable, useful knowledge, but at the very same time, I still accept the fact that, yes, he was a Victorian European man, so he had certain Western biases, right? And although we can certainly borrow some of his his ideology or some of his thought patterns, we have to be very, very careful not to follow it too dogmatically, because Marx was also speaking to a 19th century European audience, right? But that's not to say that I don't respect his contribution to socialism, but socialism wasn't invented by Karl Marx, right? And you can be a socialist without calling yourself a Marxist, right? It's absolutely possible, in my opinion. You just have to believe in a fairer world, a fair, just world, and you have to disapprove of bullying and oppressing other people. That's all. Myth number 4. Socialism is an ideology of resentment. All these degenerate, woke, heathen leftists who have overtaken the joint have now basically come into power and forced their authoritarian tolerance on the rest of us people. And basically you have to be an absolute imbecile not to see the track record of failure of socialism throughout history. Because socialism is ultimately the antithesis of meritocracy. It is an ideology of resentment, just like the story of Cain resenting Abel because Abel was favored by God for his good graces. Oh, Abel was favored by God because Abel was basically the guy who was able to produce more than Cain. And Cain takes a rock and smashes it on Abel's head. And that's basically what socialism is. It's an ideology of resentment, bucko. Because when you accept the facts of life, you realize that there's a dominance hierarchy and the world is inherently fair, and the most competent people basically naturally rise to the top. Except that this idea of socialism versus capitalism, as if they were two football teams fighting each other, right, has never really been the party line of any socialist party in the world, right? You know, you have capitalist reactionaries like Jordan Peterson basically saying shit like, oh yeah, in the fight between socialism and capitalism, capitalism is superior because of so and so and so. But as Karl Marx said, you know, I myself am not a Marxist, right? Because Marx didn't view socialism as a culture war. Or rather, Karl Marx didn't view things through the lens of some culture war between socialism and capitalism. No. You see, to Marx and to every single other socialist thinker throughout history, socialism would be an inevitable stage in human evolution, right? Basically, you start out with barbarism. Now, this is according to Marxist theory. You start out with barbarism when people live in tribes. We're talking about, you know, the first stages of civilization, when people live in tribes. Then you move on to slave society in places like Greece and Rome, right? And then after that, you move on to the Dark and Middle Ages, which is known as feudalism, when basically the peasants don't own any land, but they work on the lands of a feudal lord, right? That could be a knight, that could be a samurai, right? And they basically have to give the feudal lord a part of their produce as tribute, right? And after feudalism, the next stage in the progression is capitalism. You know, when they cut off the heads of the kings, you know, like they did in England to King Charles II, or in France to King Louis, when the people basically cut off the heads of the kings, and basically you have a new type of king known as the bourgeoisie, the business class, the capitalist class that takes power, right? And what will happen is that the relations of the classes change in a sense, because in feudal times, basically the peasants worked for the lord, right? Basically, they did not own land, and they basically had to work for the feudal lord, and they couldn't displease the feudal lord, or or they might lose their head or get kicked off the land, right? Under capitalism, there is no more feudal plantations, right? Or there are no more feudal plantations. Under capitalism, the peasant becomes the proletariat, the working class, right? Who works for the capitalist, the new age feudal lords, right? But after that, according to Marx's theory, the working classes of the world will realize that they are being exploited, that their labor, that the value that they produce as a result of their labor is being appropriated by the capitalist, right? Who does no real work, right? And eventually the working class of the world will revolt and seize power and create a dictatorship of the proletariat, or a dictatorship of the working class. That's basically the idea behind socialism, right? And finally, after socialism, when everyone has got enough wealth to enjoy, because mind you, socialists do not view wealth as something toxic, yeah? Well, we are materialists. We view wealth as the source of one's happiness. Just like Karl Marx said, religion is the opium of the masses. There is no socialist in the world who views wealth as something toxic or degenerate. We want wealth. We want our worth, right? Yeah, after everyone has gotten prosperous and there's been common prosperity, the final stage of human evolution is communism, when there are no more classes and no more money. But that's 100 years from now at least. You and I will not live to see the communist stage, but it is very possible that we can indeed bring about the socialist stage, right? When the means of production are collectively owned, not by a few men or women, but by the people who produce the value that goes into goods and services, and will receive their due, right? Because they don't work for a capitalist anymore. That's socialism. Myth number 5. Socialism never ever works. Really? So how many hours a day did your child work at the blacking factory? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Or, when you were injured at work, suppose you were injured at work, were you able to get any medical compensation from your boss? If the answer to that is yes, then obviously you are a beneficiary of socialism, right? Because throughout history, socialists have constantly agitated for better working conditions for the masses, right? Do you know how much the capitalist would pay you if he could get away with it? Zero. Because the predatory nature of the capitalist makes him want to maximize profits and minimize loss at any cost. When I say at any cost, I mean at any cost, right? If the capitalists could bring back slavery, they would bring back slavery, right? In fact, slavery itself, the slave plantations in America and Britain and the Jamaican region, were a direct result of capitalism, right? They were, because the idea behind capitalism is basically the idea that human beings, or rather I should say, the idea of the free market, basically, of Adam Smith's free market. Something which I think Adam Smith got wrong, but nevertheless, he was making a faulty observation, was that human beings were all naturally self-interested, right? And basically, the goal of every human being is to maximize profit and minimize loss. So basically, slave plantations are basically capitalism on steroids. If the capitalist could pay you zero, he would pay you zero. And this is precisely the reason why right-wingers, despite the fact that they hate freedom, they hate people dressing how they like, styling their hair how they like, and basically presenting themselves how they like, they will be the first to protest vehemently about their freedoms being lost when people start making government regulations against their businesses, right? Because to the right-wing reactionary, freedom basically does not mean the freedom of the many, but the freedom of the few in order to exploit, right? To pay as little as possible and work you as long as possible, right? The freedom of the capitalist to basically have carte blanche over his or her workers, right? Just like Karl Marx once said, a miser, a capitalist is a rational miser, but a miser is a capitalist gone mad, right? So yeah, if you have sick leave and you have basically employment benefits, if your children don't have to work at a blacking factory, thank socialism. Don't thank capitalism for it, right? But it's not just labor laws and, protections for children and vulnerable groups that you have socialists to thank for, right? In feudal China or feudal Russia, those places were backwater dumps, right? Basically under the Tsar, right? Over 50% of Russians were illiterate peasants, right? Life expectancy was far lower than what you see in Russia today, right? And yet, today, you look at Russia, say what you want about Putin, say what you want about the Kremlin, but Russia is an educated nation, not a perfect nation, but it is educated. It has universal healthcare, and of course, almost 100% of the population is literate, right? The cruel and inhumane practice of foot binding was practiced in feudal China, but it was not Confucius who endorsed it, yeah? It came around hundreds of years after Confucius died, okay? But this cruel and inhumane practice was practiced in feudal China. The Kangxi Emperor tried to outlaw it, but people still carried it out, right? The nationalists, the Kuomintang, tried to ban it, but people still carried it out. But do you know who put an end to foot binding for good? It was the socialists, right? It was the socialists who put an end to this backward and barbarous tradition, right? And brought China into the modern world. Now you could say that China is not a perfect country, and I will be the first to agree with you, right? There are many things the Chinese government does wrong. But you cannot deny the fact that there are many, many aspects of Chinese society in the warlord era or the feudal era that the socialists put an end to, right? Besides foot binding, they also put an end to the hogging or the monopolizing of farms by certain privileged individuals, right? Through a series of land redistribution. The literature of which I still need to educate myself on, so I can't speak with authority on this. But what I do know is that if the socialists had not taken power, and even though China today is not a perfectly socialist country, if the socialists had not taken over, you would see far, far more poor people in China today. You would see women with bound feet. You might see women with bound feet. And the fact is that the life expectancy of the Chinese people, would be far lower. In short, socialism saved China, not capitalism, right? And although China has a long way to go in order to realize the dream of socialism, or to realize the vision, if you will, of socialism, nevertheless, at least socialism put it on that trajectory and gave people hope for a better future, right? Not just for the few, but for the many. So that's it for our 5 myths about socialism. Next week, or the week after next, I'll come back with another 5 rabid lies about socialism, right? I just want to say that socialism doesn't promise a utopia, right? We have to make it very clear that socialism does not promise a utopia in the same way reactionary ideology does, right? Reactionary ideology promises you a house, a wife, children, and a white picket fence if only you work hard, right? But socialism does not promise a utopia. It never claims to be, right, the system that will solve all of human suffering, right? But socialism is understood to be a historical process. Socialist leaders are not perfect. They make mistakes, but they do self-criticize, right? And because socialism is a science, if evidence to the contrary has been found, we will change our thinking, right? Just like Fidel Castro, right? Basically apologized to the LGBT community because of his misguided views on the LGBT community, right? Socialists are not rabid idealists who will refuse to change their stances on things, right? And if new modes of production ever should come up that will benefit the masses more than socialism, socialists would be the very first people to change their tune, right? Do you see what I mean? I hope I'm putting that in lucid terms, right? So if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments section, and my supporters, my 1,400 supporters, I should say, will do their best to try and answer your comments. If you have any comments about socialism, you can pay the Socialist Party of Malaysia a visit. We have an office in Kota Damansara, and we also have another office. Well, we have other offices throughout Malaysia, but my office is in Kota Damansara. I'm not there all the time, but yeah, if you want to ask people, if you want to ask us anything about socialism, just ask a socialist. We're not going to shoot you. We're not going to stab you. We are not hateful, violent people, essentially, right? So yeah, that's about it. And yes, have a good night, and I will see you in the next video. Bangunlah rakyat yang tertindas, bangun rakyat yang diperas, nyalakan api perjuangan, menjulang kebenaran, hancurkan segala penindasan. Ayo kita bangun. Dunia baru kita dirikan, pasti jadi kenyataan. Perjuangan penghabisan bersatu kita lawan. Dan internasional pastikan berjaya. Perjuangan penghabisan bersatu kita lawan, dan internasional pastikan berjaya. Tiada raja atau penguasa, peluru atau penjara yang dapat menghalangi kita menjadi rakyat merdeka. Selagi nyawa dalam diri, perjuangan takkan henti. Biar darah membasah bumi, menyeratakan sekali. Perjuangan penghabisan bersatu kita lawan, dan internasional pastikan berjaya.